There is a tale I keep returning to, one that lingers in the quiet corners of memory long after the candles have burned low. Good evening, my friends. I am Professor Salamander, and tonight I invite you to walk with me through a mystery hidden just beyond the edge of ordinary magic. Some secrets do not arrive with thunder or warning. They appear like a sudden flicker in the dark, asking to be understood. So settle in, and let us uncover this forgotten wonder together. The night it began, nothing felt unusual. The sky above the burrow was calm, the kind of deep blue that stretched endlessly without a single cloud daring to cross it. A faint wind moved through the orchard, brushing the leaves together in a quiet, restless whisper. Inside, the house glowed with warm light, windows shining like small beacons against the dark. Ron Weasley sat at the kitchen table, turning his wand slowly between his fingers. He wasn't thinking about anything important. That, perhaps, was what made it strange later. Across from him, Hermione Granger had a book open, though she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. She watched Ron in that quiet, observant way she had when she knew something before anyone else did. "You're doing it again," she said. Ron blinked. "Doing what?" "Spinning your wand like that. You only do it when something's bothering you." "It's not bothering me," Ron muttered, though he stopped anyway, setting the wand down flat against the table. "Just thinking." "About work?" she asked. Ron shrugged. "Maybe." That wasn't entirely true. Work had been strange lately. Not dangerous, nothing like the war, but odd in a way that didn't sit right. Reports that didn't match what Aurors found. Small magical disturbances that vanished before they could be examined. Like something was there, and then simply wasn't. Across the room, the clock ticked steadily, each second landing heavier than the last. Hermione closed her book. "Harry mentioned something today," she said carefully. Ron looked up at once. "What about?" "A case, a wizard in Kent. He claimed his magic, surged, uncontrolled, like a burst." Ron frowned. "That happens. Faulty spellwork, nerves?" "No," Hermione interrupted gently. "He wasn't casting anything." The words hung in the air. Ron leaned back slightly, the chair creaking beneath him. "So what? It just happened?" Hermione nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ron gave a short, dismissive breath. "Probably just someone looking for attention. You know how people get. One weird flicker of magic and suddenly it's a ministry-level mystery." Hermione didn't smile. "Ron," she said quietly, "they've had 3 reports this week." That made him pause. Before he could respond, the kitchen door creaked open, and a gust of cool night air slipped inside. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling something loose outside, a hanging charm that chimed sharply, once, twice. Ron turned his head. Something about the sound felt off. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Hermione frowned. "Just the wind." Then it happened. A flash. Not lightning, not exactly. It didn't come from the sky. It came from nowhere. A streak of pale blue light tore across the kitchen, so fast it left no trail, no sound, only a sharp, cracking silence that followed it like an echo. And it struck Ron. He didn't even have time to react. One moment he was sitting there, breathing, thinking, alive in the simplest way. And the next, something slammed into him with a force that wasn't physical, wasn't visible, but felt like it tore straight through his chest. Ron gasped. The chair tipped backward as he fell, crashing hard against the floor. "Ron!" Hermione was at his side instantly, her voice sharp with panic. "Ron, can you hear me?" He could hear her, but everything else felt wrong. The world had gone distant, like he was underwater, sounds muffled and stretched. His hands trembled uncontrollably, fingers curling and uncurling as if they didn't belong to him. There was a heat in his chest. No, worse than heat. Magic. Not the steady, familiar presence he'd known all his life. Not the quiet hum that came with every spell, every flick of the wand. This was wild. Uncontrolled. It surged through him like a storm breaking loose. Ron clenched his teeth, trying to force himself upright, but the moment he moved, crack! A burst of energy shot from him. The kitchen lights exploded. Glass shattered outward from the bulbs, raining down in sharp fragments. Hermione jerked back just in time, shielding her face with her arm. "Ron, stop!" she shouted, though she knew instantly he wasn't doing it on purpose. "I'm not—" He choked, gripping the floor as another surge built inside him. It felt like pressure. Like something pushing outward, desperate to escape. His wand, still lying on the table, lifted suddenly into the air. Neither of them touched it. "Ron, your magic." "I know," he snapped, panic rising in his voice. The wand spun once, then fired. A jet of sparks shot across the room, slamming into the far wall and leaving a scorched mark that spread like cracks in glass. Silence followed. Heavy. Waiting. Ron froze. The pressure stopped. Just like that. The magic vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving behind nothing but the echo of it, like the memory of thunder after a storm. His breathing was ragged. Hermione reached for him again, slower this time. "Are you hurt?" Ron shook his head weakly, though he didn't feel certain. I don't know." Carefully, he pushed himself up onto his elbows. The kitchen looked different now. Broken. Lights gone, walls marked, the faint smell of something burned lingering in the air. And his wand was still floating. For a second, neither of them noticed. Then Hermione's eyes widened. "Ron..." He followed her gaze. The wand hung there, perfectly still, as if held by an invisible hand. And then, slowly, it turned, pointing directly at him. Ron's breath caught. "I'm not doing that," he whispered. Hermione didn't answer. Because she knew. Whatever had struck him, whatever that bolt of blue magic had been, it hadn't left. And deep inside Ron, something stirred again. Ron did not move. The wand remained suspended in the air, its tip fixed on him with unsettling precision, as though it were no longer an object, but a decision already made. A thin pulse of blue light flickered along its length. "Ron," Hermione Granger said quietly, her voice steadier than her eyes, "I need you to stay very still." "I am staying still," Ron muttered, though his heart hammered so loudly it felt as if it might shake the entire room apart. He could feel it again. That pressure. Not as violent as before, but present, lurking just beneath the surface, like something coiled and waiting. "I think," Hermione continued slowly, her gaze locked on the wand, "I think it's reacting to you, not the other way around." "That's not better," Ron said. "No," she admitted. "It isn't." For a long moment, nothing happened. The broken kitchen held its breath. Outside, the wind had died completely, as though the world itself had paused to watch. Then, without warning, the wand dropped. It fell from the air and clattered onto the wooden floor between them. Ron flinched, but no burst followed. No crack of uncontrolled magic. Only silence. Hermione reached out cautiously and picked it up, turning it in her hand as if expecting it to resist her. "It's normal," she said after a moment, though her tone suggested she did not fully believe it. "No unusual warmth. No residual spellwork I can detect." Ron pushed himself into a sitting position, rubbing a hand across his face. That didn't feel normal. "No," Hermione repeated, more firmly this time. He looked at his hands. They had stopped trembling, but a faint tingling lingered in his fingertips, like the echo of a spell he had never cast. "What was that?" he asked. Hermione hesitated. "I don't know," she said at last, "but I don't think it was an attack in the usual sense. There was no incantation, no wand movement, no presence." Ron gave a short, humorless laugh. "Brilliant. So something hit me, nearly blew up the kitchen, and we don't even know what it is." Hermione met his gaze. "We know one thing." "What?" "It chose you." The words settled heavily between them. Ron looked away first. "That doesn't make any sense." "Maybe not yet," Hermione said, "but we've seen something like this before. Uncontrolled magic tied to a person, not a spell. It's rare, but it exists." Ron frowned. "You mean, like, accidental magic? Like when kids do things without meaning to?" Hermione shook her head. "No, this is different. Accidental magic is chaotic, but it's still natural. This felt..." She searched for the word. "Directed." Ron didn't like the sound of that. Before he could respond, a sharp crack echoed from the living room, loud, unmistakable. "Apparition." Both of them turned at once. "Harry," Ron said, already pushing himself to his feet. They hurried through the doorway, stepping over scattered debris, and found Harry Potter standing just inside the house, wand drawn, eyes scanning the room with practiced urgency. "I felt it," Harry said immediately. "What happened?" Ron opened his mouth, then hesitated. For once, he did not have a quick answer. Hermione stepped forward. "There was a surge of magic. It struck Ron directly. No visible source, no warning." Harry's gaze snapped to Ron. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Ron said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "It's gone now. Or at least, it's quiet." Harry lowered his wand slightly but did not relax. "That's the third one tonight." Ron blinked. "Third what?" "Magical surges," Harry said grimly. "Different locations. No connection between them. Except now there is." He looked directly at Ron. Hermione crossed her arms, thinking rapidly. "You're saying the same phenomenon that affected those other wizards has now attached itself to Ron?" Harry nodded. "It fits. Sudden burst. No spell. No attacker." Ron let out a breath. "Brilliant. So I'm just another case now." "No," Harry said sharply. "You're not. The others, once it happened, it stopped. No lingering effects." Ron felt that pressure again, faint but undeniable. "It didn't stop for me," he said quietly. Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance. That was the moment the truth began to take shape. The conflict was no longer a distant mystery, no longer something happening to strangers in far-off places. It was here, inside Ron. Hermione spoke first. "Then whatever this is, it hasn't finished with you." Ron swallowed. "That's not exactly comforting." Harry stepped closer, his expression firm, focused. "We'll figure it out. But until we do, you're not handling this alone. Not for a second." Ron managed a weak grin. wasn't planning to. But even as he said it, he felt it again. Stronger this time. A flicker beneath his ribs. A pulse that did not belong to him. And far beyond the walls of the burrow, beyond the quiet fields and sleeping villages, something stirred in answer. Something that had found him. And was not yet done. Harry did not allow Ron to spend the night at the burrow. Mrs. Weasley had not yet come back from visiting George, and Harry insisted that explaining shattered lamps and scorched walls to her in the middle of the night would not improve anyone's thinking. More importantly, he did not trust whatever strange force had struck Ron to remain quiet until morning. Hermione agreed at once, and within half an hour the three of them had left the burrow under a disillusionment charm and apparated to a secure ministry entrance known only to Aurors and senior officials. By the time they reached the lower levels, Ron felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. It was as though some invisible hand had reached into him, stirred up everything that made him magical, and left it unsettled. Every moving portrait they passed seemed too loud, every torch too bright, every sound edged with a brittle sharpness that set his teeth on end. He said nothing about it, because Harry already looked grim enough, and Hermione had entered that cold, focused silence she wore when fear had become a problem to solve. They were met outside a sealed chamber by a stocky witch with iron-gray hair and a voice that could have cut glass. "Healer Vane," Harry said. "Thank you for coming." "I was told it could not wait," she replied, her pale eyes settling on Ron. Judging by the state of him, that was not an exaggeration. Ron almost objected to being spoken about as if he were a misfiring cauldron, but the truth was that he did not feel entirely like himself. He followed her into the chamber, where silver instruments hovered over a narrow bed, and a web of protective wards shimmered faintly along the walls. The room smelled of clean linen, potion fumes, and old stone. "Sit," said Healer Vane. Ron sat. She did not waste time with comforting phrases. She raised her wand and began a long sequence of diagnostic spells, each more intricate than the last. Threads of gold, green, and violet light passed over Ron's chest, arms, and head. A silver ring appeared around his wrist, tightened, glowed once, and vanished. A glass dial on the wall spun wildly, steadied, and then began to tremble in short, nervous jerks. Hermione noticed it first. "That is not meant to do that, is it?" "No," said Healer Vane, still watching Ron. "It is not." Ron tried to make a joke, but the words never formed. The pressure inside him had returned the moment he crossed the threshold of the chamber. It was not painful at first. It was more like standing too close to a storm and feeling every hair rise before the lightning came. Harry folded his arms. "Can you tell what it is?" Healer Vane lowered her wand. "I can tell what it is not. It is not a curse. It is not possession. It is not a blood hex, a parasitic enchantment, or an implanted charm. It has not damaged his magical core, but it has entangled itself with it." Ron looked up sharply. "Entangled?" The healer finally met his eyes. "Mr. Weasley, your magic is behaving as though it is sharing space with something else." The chamber fell silent. Hermione stepped closer. "Something else, as in another magical signature?" "Yes." "Another wizard?" "Not exactly." Healer Vane's expression grew even more severe. "Another pattern, an active one." Ron stared at her, trying to understand and failing. "You make it sound like a spell is alive." "In a sense," she said, "some spells are." Harry's face darkened. "Department of Mysteries." "That would be my first guess," Healer Vane replied. "This does not resemble ordinary field magic. It is too old in structure, too precise in its instability. Someone was experimenting with bonded enchantment, and something has slipped its bounds. Ron gave a disbelieving laugh that sounded weak even to himself. Of course it has, because when has anything ever gone wrong around experimental magic kept in the deepest, strangest part of the ministry? Hermione ignored the attempt at humor. If it is bonded, can it be removed? Healer Vane did not answer at once, and that pause was enough. Can it? Harry asked. Perhaps, she said slowly, but forcing separation might do more harm than leaving it in place until we understand it. Right now, the greater danger is agitation. If the pattern is still anchoring itself, any emotional or magical shock could trigger another surge. Ron leaned back, folding his arms as if that could make the words less real. So the official medical advice is that I am not allowed to get upset. In your case, said the healer dryly, I would recommend avoiding heroics, arguments, advanced spellcasting, and anything explosive. Harry glanced at him. Hermione glanced at him. Ron frowned. I am not that reckless. Neither of them spoke, which was worse than if they had laughed. Healer Vane drew a narrow crystal phial from her robes, filled it with a pale blue potion from a hovering vial, and handed it to Ron. This will calm the fluctuations for a few hours. It will not solve the problem, but it may keep your magic from responding to every stray impulse. Ron sniffed it suspiciously. That smells like wet parchment. It also costs more than your broom, she said. Drink it. He did. The potion was colder than ice and left a metallic taste at the back of his throat, but within moments the pressure in his chest eased slightly, as though thick waves had retreated from a shore without entirely leaving it. Hermione drew a breath. If this came from the Department of Mysteries, then someone there knows more than they are saying. Harry nodded. I'll get us access. Healer Vane's mouth tightened. You will get resistance. Unspeakables do not enjoy sharing their mistakes. That makes 4 of us, Harry said. For the first time that night, a ghost of a smile passed over Ron's face, but it vanished quickly. He looked at his hands again. They were steady now, at least on the surface, yet he could not shake the sense that the stillness was borrowed. Beneath it, something waited with patient intelligence. He became aware then of a faint sound inside the chamber. Not from the door or the walls, not from the instruments. It was coming from behind him, from the high window of enchanted glass that looked out not onto London, but onto a contained slice of midnight sky used for celestial observation spells. A single line of blue light had appeared there. It was thin as a crack in porcelain, and it ran across the darkness above the cityless void beyond the glass. Hermione saw it next. Harry! They all turned. The line brightened. Then, with terrifying slowness, it bent. Not like lightning branching through a storm, but like a finger curling. It pointed directly at Ron. The silver instruments overhead began to rattle. One of the hovering trays tipped and spun. The dial on the wall lurched wildly. Healer Vane snapped, "Do not move." Ron had no intention of moving. The potion's cool calm vanished in a heartbeat as the thing inside him answered the light in the glass. He felt it rise through his chest and throat like a tide of fire without heat, and the wards around the chamber flashed into view, each one blazing bright. Harry's wand was already out. Hermione's followed at once. "What is it?" Ron asked, though he could barely hear his own voice. The blue line outside the glass thickened and struck the warded window with a silent burst. The entire chamber shuddered. The protective wards held, but only just. Great rings of silver magic spread across the walls and ceiling, and sparks fell like brief, dying stars. Ron doubled over as pain tore through him at last, sharp and sudden and deep enough to steal the breath from his lungs. "It is trying to reach him," Hermione said, and there was alarm in her voice now, real alarm, the kind that only came when knowledge had run out before danger had. Healer Vane thrust both hands forward and reinforced the chamber with a sequence of blazing charms. "Mr. Potter, if you have any influence with the Department of Mysteries, use it now." Harry did not look away from the glass. "I was already planning to." "Plan faster." The blue force struck again. This time the glass held, but the shimmer around Ron's body burst outward in a ring that slammed into the nearest table and sent instruments skidding across the floor. Harry turned instantly. "Ron!" "I'm here," Ron forced out, though black spots were dancing at the edges of his sight. Healer Vane knelt in front of him, studying him with fierce concentration. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever is attached to you has found a signal outside this chamber. That means the bond is active in both directions. It can sense, and it can be sensed." Ron swallowed hard. "That sounds bad." "It is bad," she said, "because if it can call to you, then someone, somewhere, may be calling through it." The chamber went still for one terrible heartbeat. Then the blue light beyond the glass vanished. The rattling instruments settled, the wards dimmed, the air stopped thrumming. Ron drew in a ragged breath and slowly straightened, though every muscle in his body felt spent. The pain retreated, leaving behind dread so clear and cold that it felt almost like clarity. Harry lowered his wand, but not by much. "So this wasn't random?" "No," Hermione said softly. "It never was." Ron looked from one face to another and understood, with a certainty he could not have explained, that the conflict before them had changed again. At first it had been about strange magic striking unknown victims. Then it had become about the force lodged inside him. Now at last the shape of the truth had begun to emerge. Something had not merely found Ron. Something had been looking for him. And somewhere in the Ministry, behind locked doors and older secrets, there was a reason why. The Department of Mysteries did not welcome visitors, even when those visitors arrived with the authority of an Auror and the urgency of a problem that could not be ignored. Harry led the way through corridors that grew quieter and colder with every turn, as though the Ministry itself wished to forget that such a place existed beneath its ordered surface. The walls lost their framed notices and polished finishes, becoming plain stone interrupted only by narrow doors that bore no markings. The air carried a faint metallic scent, like old magic that had settled and never entirely faded. Ron walked beside Hermione, aware of every step he took and every breath he drew, because the presence inside him had not retreated completely. It remained calm for now, subdued by the healer's potion. Yet there was a sense that it listened, that it leaned toward something ahead with quiet anticipation. "That reaction in the chamber," Hermione said in a low voice, careful not to let it carry beyond them. "It was not merely a response. It behaved like recognition." Ron did not like the sound of that, though he forced himself to keep his tone steady. "Recognition of what exactly? Because I do not recall ever meeting a piece of rogue magic before." Hermione's eyes flickered toward him, thoughtful and uneasy. "Perhaps you did not meet it, but something about you may still be known to it." "That makes even less sense." "I know," she admitted, "but nothing about this does." Harry stopped before a door that looked no different from the others, though the faint shimmer along its edges revealed layers of protection far stronger than anything they had passed so far. He raised his wand and tapped the stone 3 times in a precise rhythm, then spoke a phrase too soft for Ron to catch. For a moment, nothing happened, and then the door dissolved into a dark archway that seemed to swallow the light around it. A figure stepped out of the shadows beyond. He wore plain robes of deep gray, his face lined but unreadable, his eyes sharp with the kind of attention that missed nothing and trusted even less. Ron had seen unspeakables before, though rarely this close, and there was always something unsettling about them, as if they belonged more to the secrets they guarded than to the world outside. "You are not expected," the man said, his voice carrying no trace of curiosity, only controlled irritation. Harry did not hesitate. "We have a situation that originated here, whether you acknowledge it or not." The unspeakable's gaze shifted briefly to Ron, lingering just long enough to suggest recognition, or perhaps concern carefully concealed. "You should not have brought him." Ron bristled despite everything pressing down on him. "That is a bit rich, considering something from your department seems to have decided to move in." Hermione placed a light hand on his arm, a silent warning to hold his temper, but the unspeakable did not react to the remark at all. Instead, he studied Ron more closely, as though comparing him to something remembered. "It has already progressed further than I was told," the man said quietly. Harry's patience thinned. "Then you were told about it, which means you know what it is." The unspeakable exhaled slowly, and for the first time a hint of strain appeared in his expression. "Come inside. This cannot be discussed in a corridor." They stepped through the archway, and the door sealed behind them without a sound. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than the space it should have occupied, filled with structures that defied easy explanation. Tall glass columns held swirling lights that moved like living things, and long tables bore devices that hummed faintly with restrained power. At the center of the room stood a raised platform, upon which rested a circular frame of silver metal, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when one looked directly at them. Ron felt the presence inside him stir. Not violently, not yet, but with unmistakable interest. "What is this place?" he asked, though the answer already pressed at the edges of his thoughts. The unspeakable did not look away from him. "This is where we attempted to map the boundaries between magic as it is cast and magic as it exists independently of will." Hermione stepped forward slightly, drawn despite herself. "You were studying autonomous spell forms." "Yes," the man said, though we did not call them that at the time. "We believed it possible to create a pattern of magic that could sustain itself without constant direction, capable of adapting, learning, and responding." Ron let out a disbelieving breath. "You tried to make a spell think." "We tried to understand whether magic itself could be guided to behave as more than a tool," the unspeakable corrected, though the distinction did little to ease the weight of the revelation. Harry's voice hardened, and something went wrong. The man's silence was answer enough. Hermione's gaze shifted to the silver frame on the platform. "Is that where it was contained?" "It was not meant to be containment," the unspeakable replied. "It was meant to be a focus, a way to observe and refine the patterns safely." Ron took a step closer before he could stop himself, drawn by a pull that felt both external and deeply personal. The moment he moved, the symbols along the frame brightened, and a faint blue glow spread across its surface like frost forming on glass. Harry noticed at once. "Ron, stay back." Ron froze, though the damage had already been done. The presence inside him surged, not with violence, but with recognition so clear that it left no room for doubt. The thing in the frame responded in kind, its light intensifying until the entire chamber seemed to breathe in unison. "What did you do?" Harry demanded. The Unspeakable's voice dropped, tight with something that might have been regret. "We created a pattern that required a stable anchor to fully develop. We believed it would attach to a controlled source within the chamber, something we could monitor and adjust." Hermione's eyes widened as understanding struck her. "But it did not remain here." "No," the man said, "it did not." Ron swallowed, the truth forming with dreadful clarity. "It found something else." The Unspeakable met his gaze. "It found you." The words settled over the room like a verdict. Harry stepped forward, anger breaking through his restraint. "Why him?" The answer came slowly, as though each word carried weight the man could not easily set aside. "Because the pattern does not attach to power alone. It attaches to stability, to resilience, to a magical core that has endured disruption without collapse. It requires a host who can survive its growth." Ron felt something cold move through him. "That sounds like a terrible qualification." "It is a rare one," the Unspeakable said, "and it is not something we anticipated encountering outside controlled conditions." Hermione spoke carefully, though urgency edged her tone. "If it continues to develop within him, what happens?" The man looked at the glowing frame, then back at Ron. "If the bond completes, the pattern will stabilize fully. At that point, it will no longer be separate from him." Ron's throat tightened. "And if it does not complete?" "Then the instability will increase," the Unspeakable said. "The surges will grow stronger, less predictable, until either the pattern collapses or the host does." Silence fell again, heavier than before. Harry's jaw set. "Then we stop it before it gets that far." The Unspeakable did not argue, but neither did he agree. "Stopping it may not be as simple as you believe. The pattern has already chosen its anchor. It will resist removal." Ron looked down at his hands, then back at the glowing frame, and felt the truth settle into place with a clarity that left no room for denial. The conflict was no longer about discovering what had happened, or even how to prevent it from spreading. It had become something far more direct. He had to decide whether to fight what was inside him or understand it before it decided for him. And deep within his chest, the presence pulsed once, as though it had heard every word. The chamber did not fall silent so much as it seemed to tighten, as though every object within it had become aware of the decision that had yet to be made, and waited for it with a patience that felt almost deliberate. Ron stood at the edge of the raised platform, his gaze fixed on the silver frame that pulsed faintly with that same pale blue light he had first seen tear across the kitchen at the Burrow. The glow was not constant, nor did it flicker like ordinary magic, but instead rose and fell in measured intervals, as if it followed a rhythm that belonged to something thinking rather than something cast. He could feel it now without doubt. Not merely the presence within him, but the connection between the two. It was not like holding a wand, nor like casting a spell, nor even like the strange, uncontrolled surges that had shaken him earlier. This was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more unsettling, because it did not feel foreign. It felt as though something had reached into the structure of his magic and learned its shape. Hermione moved closer, her eyes never leaving the frame. "It is synchronizing," she said softly, more to herself than to the others. "The pulses are aligning with his magical signature." Harry's voice carried a restrained edge. "Which means what exactly, Hermione? Because at the moment that sounds like a polite way of saying it is settling in." "It means," she replied, forcing calm into her tone, "that the bond is progressing toward stability. If we interrupt it now, we risk destabilizing both Ron and the pattern simultaneously." Ron let out a slow breath, though it did nothing to ease the tension building inside him. "And if we do nothing?" The unspeakable answered without hesitation. "Then the bond completes." Ron turned toward him. "You keep saying that as though it is some sort of final state, but you have not said what it actually means for me." The man's expression did not change, yet there was a weight behind his gaze that suggested he understood exactly what Ron was asking. "It means that the pattern will no longer behave as an external force. It will become integrated with your magic entirely. Your spells will not merely be yours, but shaped by it. Your instincts will not act alone, but in concert with something that has its own logic." Ron felt a flicker of anger rise, sharp enough to cut through the unease. "So I become what, exactly? A walking experiment?" "No," the unspeakable said, and for the first time there was something close to certainty in his voice. "You become something that has never existed before. That is not reassuring." "No," the man agreed. "It is not meant to be." Harry stepped forward, placing himself between Ron and the platform, as though the simple act might place a barrier between his friend and the thing that had already crossed into him. "We are not letting this continue without control, and certainly not without understanding what we are dealing with." The unspeakable inclined his head slightly. "Control is precisely what we attempted, and precisely what failed. The pattern adapted beyond our parameters. It began to seek an anchor not defined by containment, but by compatibility." Hermione's eyes narrowed as the implications settled. "It chose Ron because he could withstand the instability." "Yes," the man said, "and because his magical core has endured disruption and reformation multiple times." Ron blinked. "What is that supposed to mean?" Hermione answered before the unspeakable could. "It means your magic has been through conditions most wizards never experience, and it recovered. The Horcrux, the exposure to dark magic, the battle itself. Your magic has already adapted once to survive something unnatural." Ron stared at her, stunned. "You are saying that is what made me suitable for this?" "I am saying," she replied carefully, "that your magic has already proven it can endure what should have broken it." That did not make him feel stronger. It made him feel like a target. The frame on the platform brightened again, and this time the light extended outward in faint threads that reached toward Ron, stopping just short of him, as though testing the distance. The air between them seemed to hum, not loudly, but with a quiet insistence that pressed against the senses. Harry raised his wand immediately. "That is far enough." The threads paused, and for a moment it seemed as though they might retreat. Then Ron felt it. Not a surge, not an attack, but a pull. It was subtle, almost gentle, yet impossible to ignore, as if something on the other side of that frame had recognized him and extended a hand rather than a weapon. His breath caught. Hermione saw it at once. "Ron, do not respond to it." "I am not trying to," he said, though the truth was more complicated than that. He was not reaching out, yet something within him leaned toward the connection with an instinct that felt as natural as breathing. The unspeakable watched closely, his expression unreadable. "It is attempting to complete the bond through proximity." Harry's voice sharpened. "Then we increase the distance." He stepped forward, placing a stronger barrier charm between Ron and the platform. The air shimmered as the spell settled, forming a visible distortion that bent the light around it. For a moment, it worked. The threads of blue light hesitated, pressing against the barrier but not crossing it. The hum in the air lessened, and Ron felt the pull weaken. Relief began to surface, tentative and fragile. Then the pattern changed. The threads did not push harder. They did not flare or lash out. Instead, they shifted, altering their rhythm in a way that felt almost thoughtful. Ron's eyes widened slightly. It is not forcing its way through. Hermione's voice dropped to a whisper. It is adapting. The threads thinned, then divided, flowing along the edges of the barrier instead of against it, seeking a path not through resistance, but around it. The movement was precise, deliberate, and deeply unsettling, because it carried the unmistakable impression of intent. Harry tightened his grip on his wand. That is not possible. It is, the unspeakable said quietly. That was the purpose of the experiment. Ron felt a chill settle over him. You made something that learns. The man did not deny it. The threads reached the edge of the barrier's boundary, then curved inward, slipping through a gap so narrow it should not have existed. The moment they crossed, the connection snapped into place again, stronger than before. Ron staggered as the pull returned, no longer gentle but insistent. Ron! Hermione's voice cut through the rising tension. I am all right, he said quickly, though his hands clenched at his sides as he fought the instinct to step forward. It is just louder now. The blue light intensified, and for an instant the entire frame seemed to shift, as though something within it had turned its attention fully toward him. Then, suddenly, the light withdrew. The threads snapped back into the frame, and the hum faded as though it had never been there. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. This one felt aware. Ron straightened slowly, his breathing uneven but steadying. What just happened? The unspeakable spoke with a certainty that left no room for doubt. It learned something. Harry frowned. About what? The man's gaze did not leave Ron. About him. Hermione folded her arms tightly, her mind racing ahead of the moment. If it can adapt that quickly, then containment is no longer a reliable option. No, the unspeakable agreed. It is not. Ron looked between them, the weight of the situation settling into something sharper, more defined. The conflict was no longer a question of whether the bond could be broken easily, nor whether it could be ignored until it resolved itself. It had become a race. A race between understanding the thing that had chosen him and the pace at which it continued to evolve within him. And as Ron stood there, feeling the quiet pulse of that presence beneath his ribs, he understood something else as well. It was no longer waiting passively. It was learning him. And sooner or later, it would decide what to do with what it learned. The chamber did not return to its former stillness after the light withdrew, because something had changed in a way that could not be undone, and all of them felt it, even if none of them spoke it aloud at once. Ron stood where he was, his breathing gradually evening out, yet the quiet inside him no longer felt like calm, because beneath it there was a steady awareness that had not been there before, like a second rhythm moving alongside his own thoughts. It did not speak, and it did not force him to act, yet its presence was unmistakable, as though something had begun to observe rather than simply exist. Hermione broke the silence first, though her voice was measured with care, as if she feared that any sudden word might provoke another reaction. It did not attempt to overwhelm the barrier when it could not pass directly, which suggests that its priority is not force, but connection. Harry frowned slightly, his wand still lowered but not entirely at rest. "You are saying it is choosing not to attack." "I am saying," Hermione replied, "that it has not behaved like an attack at any point. Every surge, every reaction has been in response to Ron, rather than in opposition to him." Ron let out a slow breath, though the thought did not ease him. That sounds like a very polite way of describing something that nearly blew apart a kitchen and a ministry chamber in the same night. The unspeakable did not dispute that, though he stepped closer to the platform, his attention fixed on the silver frame that had now dimmed to a faint, steady glow. The instability we observed before was the result of incomplete bonding. The pattern required a host to anchor itself fully. Without that, it reacted unpredictably to any external influence. Ron folded his arms, not out of comfort, but to keep them from betraying the tension that still lingered in his muscles. "So what I am feeling now is what, exactly, the stable version of something that nearly tore me apart." "Not stable," the man corrected quietly. "Not yet, but closer to it." Harry glanced at Ron, then back at the unspeakable. "And when it reaches that point?" The answer came without hesitation, though there was no comfort in it. "Then it will no longer behave as an external anomaly. It will become part of his magical structure entirely, indistinguishable from his own power." Ron shook his head slowly, trying to process the meaning behind the words. "You keep saying that as though it is inevitable." The unspeakable met his gaze directly. "At this stage, it may be." Hermione stepped forward, her posture tense with thought. "There must be a way to interrupt the process before it reaches completion, something that disrupts the pattern without harming Ron's core." "There may be," the man said, "but it would require understanding the pattern's internal logic, and that is precisely what we failed to achieve before it left containment." Ron gave a dry, humorless smile. "Brilliant. So we are dealing with something that learns faster than you can study it." "That is an accurate assessment," the unspeakable replied. The words settled heavily, yet they carried a strange clarity with them, because the nature of the conflict was no longer uncertain. It was no longer a question of identifying the threat or locating its source. The threat was known, the source was known, and it stood within arm's reach of them all. The problem was that it wasn't behaving like anything they had ever faced. Ron turned slightly, his attention drifting back to the frame, though he kept his distance this time. The faint glow along its surface seemed almost passive now, yet he could feel the connection between them as clearly as he could feel his own pulse. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice quieter than before. "What if it is not trying to hurt me?" Harry looked at him sharply. "Ron." "I am serious," Ron continued, forcing himself to hold his ground. "Every time it reacts, it is because of something I do, or something near me. It has not acted on its own except to reach out, and even that did not feel like an attack." Hermione watched him carefully, weighing the thought rather than dismissing it. "You believe it is trying to communicate?" "I do not know," Ron admitted, "but it does not feel like something that wants to destroy me, at least not in the way dark magic does. It feels more like it is trying to understand." The unspeakable studied him with renewed interest. "That aligns with the intended design, though not with the outcome we expected." Harry crossed his arms, clearly unconvinced. "Understanding does not usually involve nearly killing the person you are trying to understand." "No," Hermione said, "but if it is learning through interaction, then those surges may have been the result of incomplete information rather than intent to harm." Ron nodded slowly. "Exactly." The chamber seemed to lean into the thought, though perhaps that was only the tension drawing their focus tighter. The unspeakable stepped closer to Ron, though not close enough to trigger another reaction. If that is the case, then direct engagement may accelerate its development, for better or worse. Harry's expression hardened, or it may accelerate the part where it becomes dangerous. That risk exists regardless, the man said calmly. The difference is whether you allow the process to unfold blindly or attempt to guide it. Hermione's mind was already moving ahead. If Ron can influence the pattern, even slightly, then we may be able to shape its behavior before it stabilizes fully. Ron raised an eyebrow. You make that sound like I am meant to train it. Not train, she corrected, though the distinction was thin. Interact. Observe how it responds, identify any consistent reactions, and use that to predict its next move. Harry looked between them, clearly uneasy. This is starting to sound like we are treating it as something with intention. Hermione met his gaze. If it adapts, then it has a form of intention, even if it does not think the way we do. Ron let out a quiet breath. Then maybe the only way to deal with it is to meet it halfway. The unspeakable did not object, though his voice carried a note of caution. If you choose that path, you must be prepared for the possibility that it learns faster than you can control. Ron gave a faint, crooked smile that did not quite reach his eyes. That seems to be a theme tonight. For a moment, none of them spoke, because the decision, though not yet fully formed, had already begun to take shape. The conflict had shifted once again. It was no longer simply about stopping the bond or surviving it. It had become about understanding it before it reached a point where understanding would no longer matter. Ron took a slow step forward, stopping well short of the platform, yet close enough that he could feel the connection strengthen slightly in response. He did not raise his wand. He did not attempt a spell. Instead, he closed his eyes briefly and focused, not on resisting the presence within him, but on acknowledging it, on letting it exist without pushing against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, the glow of the frame shifted. Not brighter, not stronger, but different. It was subtle enough that Harry almost missed it, but Hermione saw it at once. It responded, she said softly. Ron opened his eyes, a flicker of something uncertain crossing his face. I did not do anything. You did, Hermione replied. You stopped resisting. The realization settled into place, and with it came a new understanding of the path ahead. Whatever this thing was, whatever it had become, it was not something that could be defeated in the usual sense. It could not simply be cast out or destroyed without risking something far worse. It would have to be faced, understood, and perhaps, if they were careful enough, guided before it decided its own purpose entirely. Deep within Ron, the presence stirred again, not with force, but with a quiet, unmistakable awareness. It had felt him reach toward it. And for the first time, it had answered without breaking anything at all. The shift, though subtle, altered everything. Ron remained where he stood, not daring to move too quickly, because the moment he had allowed himself to stop resisting, the presence within him had changed its rhythm in response, and he understood with growing clarity that even the smallest action now carried consequence. It was no longer simply a matter of controlling his magic, but of recognizing that something else was now listening to how he chose to use it. Hermione watched him with an intensity that bordered on unease, though it was not fear that drove her attention, but calculation. It is reacting to intention, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the weight of the observation. Not to movement, not to words. but to what you mean to do before you do it." Ron exhaled slowly, keeping his gaze fixed on the silver frame, which now glowed with a faint, even light that no longer flickered unpredictably. "So if I panic, it panics. If I push, it pushes back." "Yes," Hermione said, "and if you remain calm, it appears to do the same." Harry did not lower his guard, though he shifted slightly, watching both Ron and the frame with equal caution. That means the margin for error is very small, because if it mirrors him at the wrong moment, we could be dealing with something far worse than before. The unspeakable inclined his head in agreement. The pattern was designed to adapt through interaction. What you are witnessing now is its first successful synchronization with a host. Ron frowned, the words settling heavily in his mind. "You keep calling it a pattern, but that makes it sound like something simple, something predictable, and this does not feel like that at all." "It is not simple," the man replied, "but it is structured. It follows internal rules, even if we do not yet understand them." Ron let out a quiet breath, his thoughts turning inward despite himself. The presence inside him did not resist his attention, nor did it retreat from it. It remained steady, almost patient, as though it had no need to rush what was already unfolding. He hesitated, then spoke again, his voice carrying a cautious curiosity that surprised even him. "If it is adapting to me, then it must be learning from something specific. It cannot just be copying everything at once." Hermione nodded immediately. "That is a reasonable assumption. It must prioritize certain aspects of your magic over others. Otherwise, it would remain chaotic rather than becoming more stable." Harry glanced at her. "And what exactly would it prioritize?" Hermione did not answer at once, because the answer, when it came, carried weight. "Core behaviors," she said finally. "The way Ron channels magic instinctively, the patterns he falls back on under pressure, the choices he makes when he does not have time to think." Ron gave a faint, uneasy smile. "So it is learning all my worst habits first." "Or your strongest ones," Hermione said, her tone firm despite the tension beneath it. The unspeakable stepped slightly closer to the platform, though he remained careful not to trigger another reaction. "If that is the case, then the next stage will involve more direct alignment. The pattern will attempt to synchronize not only with his magic, but with his intent." Harry's expression darkened, meaning it will start anticipating what he is going to do. "Or influencing it," Hermione added quietly. That thought lingered in the air longer than any of them would have liked. Ron felt a faint tightening in his chest, not from the presence itself, but from the realization of what that might mean. "So if I am not careful, I stop being entirely me." The unspeakable did not soften the truth. If the bond completes without guidance, that is a possibility. Harry stepped forward at once, his voice firm with certainty that cut through the growing unease. "Then we make sure it does not reach that point without us understanding how to control it." Ron glanced at him, a flicker of gratitude passing through his expression, though it did not fully ease the weight pressing down on him. "That is a good plan in theory. The problem is that we are already behind, because it is learning faster than we are." Hermione drew a slow breath, her mind already turning through possibilities. "Then we change the approach. Instead of reacting to it, we take the initiative. We test how it responds to controlled input." Ron raised an eyebrow. "You mean I start experimenting on myself?" "I mean," she corrected carefully, "you guide the interaction deliberately rather than allowing it to happen unpredictably." Harry did not look entirely convinced, though he did not object outright. "And what does that look like in practice?" Hermione's gaze shifted back to Ron. Simple actions first, small, controlled uses of magic, with clear intent behind them. We observe whether it mirrors, amplifies, or resists those actions. Ron considered that, though the idea did not sit easily with him. And if it decides to do something else entirely? Then we learn from that as well, Hermione said. The Unspeakable watched the exchange with quiet interest, though his voice carried a note of caution. Be aware that increased interaction will accelerate the bonding process. You may gain understanding more quickly, but you will also move closer to the point of no return. Ron let out a slow breath, the weight of the choice settling firmly in place. So either I wait and hope it does not get worse on its own, or I push forward and risk making it worse faster. Yes, the man said. Harry looked at Ron, his expression steady. We do not have the luxury of waiting, not after what happened tonight. Ron knew he was right. He turned back towards the platform, focusing again on the faint glow of the frame. The connection between them was clearer now, not overwhelming, but present in a way that could not be ignored. It was like standing at the edge of something vast and unseen, knowing that the smallest step forward would change everything. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm going to try something, he said. Hermione nodded once, her attention sharpening. Keep it simple. Ron raised his wand slowly, careful not to let any sudden movement break the fragile balance that had formed. He did not aim it at the frame, nor did he attempt anything complex. Instead, he focused on a basic charm, something so familiar it required no effort at all. A simple light. Lumos, he said quietly. The tip of his wand glowed at once, a steady, warm light that pushed back the shadows around them. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then the frame responded. The blue glow within it shifted, not flaring or surging, but aligning with the light from Ron's wand, matching its intensity and rhythm as though reflecting it through some unseen surface. Hermione's voice dropped to a whisper. It is mirroring the output. Ron swallowed, his grip tightening slightly on the wand. That is not too bad. Harry remained tense. Try ending it. Ron nodded and lowered his wand. Nox. The light vanished. For a heartbeat, the frame remained lit. Then, slowly, its glow faded as well. Silence returned once more, but it felt different now. Less uncertain. More connected. Ron lowered his wand completely, his thoughts racing despite the calm he forced himself to maintain. It is not just reacting randomly, it is following. Hermione nodded. Which means it can be guided. The Unspeakable's gaze lingered on the frame, then shifted back to Ron. Or it can guide you. The warning settled heavily, though it did not erase the small, fragile sense of progress that had begun to take shape. Because for the first time since the bolt of blue magic had struck him, Ron had not merely endured the connection. He had influenced it. And deep within him, the presence responded once more, not with force, not with resistance, but with something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition. It had begun to learn him. And now, at last, he had begun to learn it in return. The first controlled success should have brought relief, yet it did not, because relief belonged to ordinary dangers, to problems that became smaller once they were understood, and this was not such a problem. The light charm had proven that the pattern within Ron could be guided, but it had also proven something far more troubling, namely that the connection between them was no longer crude or accidental. It was becoming precise. No one in the chamber said so at first. Harry remained where he stood, wand still in hand, his posture as alert as if he expected the walls themselves to turn hostile. Hermione's eyes moved from Ron to the silver frame and back again, not with triumph, but with the sharpened concern of someone who had just seen a theory become real. The unspeakable watched in silence, and there was something in his expression that Ron did not like, because it suggested not surprise, but confirmation. Ron lowered his wand fully and became aware once more of the strange double rhythm inside himself. His own thoughts were still his own, and his will remained intact. Yet there was now a second awareness trailing the edges of his intent, like an echo that arrived before the sound itself had finished leaving him. It did not feel hostile. That was the worst part. If it had felt cruel or cold or overtly dark, he could have hated it with ease. Instead, it felt attentive. Hermione spoke at last, her voice quiet but exact. It aligned to the structure of the spell rather than merely copying the visible result, which means it is not mimicking surface effects. It is reading the intention that forms the magic before the charm is completed. Harry's expression tightened. Then the next step is obvious. We do not let it get any deeper. The unspeakable turned his head slightly. It is already deeper. Harry looked at him sharply. That was not an invitation for commentary. No, the man said calmly, but it was a statement that ignored the reality in front of you. If the pattern can anticipate the structure of a simple charm, then it has already crossed beyond passive attachment. It is learning through resonance. Ron frowned. And that means what, in plain English? Hermione answered before the unspeakable could. It means the thing inside you is not waiting until after you cast. It is reading how your magic gathers before the spell becomes visible. That is why it responded so smoothly. Ron absorbed that slowly, and when the meaning settled properly, it left him colder than before. So it is closer to my magic than my wand is. Yes, Hermione said. Harry muttered something under his breath that sounded deeply unflattering toward the entire Department of Mysteries. The silver frame pulsed once, softly, and the faint blue lines around its edge shifted into a new arrangement. Ron had seen nothing like it before, yet the sight stirred a flicker of recognition he could not explain. The symbols were not letters, and they were not runes in any system he knew, but they seemed to arrange themselves with purpose, almost like grammar. Hermione noticed his expression immediately. What is it? Ron hesitated, because the answer sounded ridiculous even to him. I think it is doing something different. Harry glanced at the frame. That much is obvious. No, Ron said, taking a slow breath as he searched for words that would not make him sound mad. I mean, it feels different. Before it was reacting. Now it feels as though it is waiting for me to notice. The unspeakable's eyes sharpened. Describe that more carefully. Ron gave him an annoyed look. I would love to, except I am not in the habit of describing what it feels like to have a ministry experiment living in my chest. Hermione stepped closer, her tone gentler. Try anyway. Ron looked back at the frame. The connection between them had become faintly directional, as if the pattern had ceased reaching blindly and instead turned toward him with intention. It is not pushing, it is not pulling. It is just there, like it expects something. Harry's voice was low. Something from you? Ron nodded slowly. Yes. The unspeakable folded his hands behind his back. Then the next stage may have begun sooner than expected. Hermione frowned. What next stage? The man's gaze remained fixed on Ron. Response formation. Once the bond becomes stable enough, the pattern does not merely mirror magic. It begins to test interaction through symbolic output. Ron stared at him. You are telling me it is trying to communicate with me through shifting shapes in a magical frame? In simple terms, the man said, yes. Harry's patience, already strained, thinned further. And you neglected to mention that earlier because earlier it had not yet reached this point. Ron looked from one face to the next, and for the first time since entering the chamber, he felt a stronger thread of fear than anger. Sudden surges and wild magic were one thing. He knew what it meant to survive danger. He knew how to stand against something that wanted to break him. But this was different. This was a thing becoming clearer. It was moving from force into meaning. Hermione, as ever, reached the practical question first. If it is forming symbolic responses, then we need to determine whether those responses correspond to known magical structures. It may be constructing a language from Ron's own spell patterns. The unspeakable inclined his head. That is one possibility. Harry did not lower his wand. And the other possibilities? That it is building an internal logic unique to the bond, the man said, or that it is recalling a pre-existing logic embedded in the original design. Ron gave a humorless laugh. Those options are all dreadful in slightly different ways. Hermione had already drawn her wand and conjured a sheet of parchment that hovered beside her, along with a self-inking quill. We need sequence, timing, and variation. Ron, do not attempt anything complicated. Repeat a few elementary charms and let us see if the symbols shift consistently. Harry immediately objected. He has already done enough for one night. Ron looked at him. Harry. No, Harry said, turning fully to him now. This is not a training exercise, and you are not some test subject we keep pushing until something breaks. The words were meant to protect him, and Ron knew that, but they struck harder than either of them expected, perhaps because they landed too close to what he had already begun to fear. I know that, Ron said, more sharply than intended, but the thing is already inside me whether any of us likes it or not, and standing here while it gets clever on its own does not seem safer. The chamber tightened at once. Hermione looked between them, and Ron felt it the instant the argument rose in his chest. The presence within him stirred, not violently, but with quickened attention, as though emotional force fed the bond in a way plain magic did not. The blue edge of the frame brightened. Hermione reacted first. Stop, both of you. It is responding to stress. Harry saw it too, and stepped back half a pace at once, visibly forcing calm over anger. Ron did the same, drawing in a slow breath and holding it until the pulse within the frame softened again. That, Hermione said quietly, confirms another variable. Ron exhaled. Brilliant. The unspeakable studied the frame. The bond does not distinguish cleanly between spell intent and emotional charge. To the pattern, both appear to be meaningful magical input. Ron rubbed a hand over his face. So now my temper is a research problem as well. Harry almost smiled, though the tension in him did not ease. It was always a research problem. That at least pulled a small, unwilling grin from Ron, and the moment it did, he felt the presence settle slightly, as though humor had a smoothing effect on the connection. The frame dimmed by a fraction. Hermione saw that too. Interesting. Ron looked at her suspiciously. Please do not start telling me the solution is to remain cheerful. I was not going to say that, she replied, though the look in her eyes suggested the thought had crossed her mind. But emotional state clearly influences the bond. Negative escalation sharpens it. Relief appears to soften it. The parchment beside her filled itself rapidly with notes. Ron stared at the shifting symbols in the frame and felt, beneath the unease, a strange flicker of stubbornness rise. He had spent too much of his life feeling like the extra person in the room, the one standing beside brighter minds and greater legends. He knew what it was to be overlooked, to be the one others thought would follow rather than lead. Yet this thing, whatever else it was, had chosen him specifically. The reason was terrible, but the fact remained. It had found something in him that mattered. He straightened slightly. "All right," he said, with more steadiness than he felt. "We do this properly. Small steps, no heroics, no showing off. We find out what changes the symbols and what does not." Harry looked as though he still hated the idea, but after a moment he gave a single reluctant nod. Hermione's quill hovered faster. Ron raised his wand again, this time preparing himself more carefully. He focused on the simplest levitation charm he knew, not because it was dramatic, but because it required clear direction without much force. Wingardium Leviosa. A loose silver instrument from a nearby table lifted gently into the air. At once the frame responded. 3 blue symbols rearranged themselves along its inner edge, their order distinct from before. One of them glowed more brightly than the others, then faded into balance. Hermione leaned forward. Again. Ron lowered the instrument, allowed the magic to settle, and repeated the charm with the same intention. The instrument rose. The symbols shifted into the exact same pattern. No one spoke for a moment. Then Hermione whispered, "It is consistent." The Unspeakable's face became unreadably still, which means the pattern is not improvising. It is categorizing. Harry's jaw tightened. Categorizing what? Ron answered before anyone else could, because somehow he knew. Me. The word hung there with a terrible kind of accuracy. Not his wand, not just the spell. Him. The way he formed magic, the way he felt before using it, the way emotion and intent fused in him before a charm ever left the wand. The pattern was sorting him into meaning. He tried a second charm, then a third. A locking spell. A mild warming charm. Each time, the symbols shifted in repeatable sequences. Sometimes one remained, and others changed. Sometimes all of them altered at once. Hermione's notes multiplied. Harry kept watch. The Unspeakable said very little. And with each successful repetition, the sense of expectation within the bond grew stronger. At last, Ron lowered his wand again, not from panic, but from fatigue. "It is learning faster now." "Yes," Hermione said, though she sounded more troubled than pleased. "And so are we, but not quickly enough." Ron glanced at the frame and saw that the symbols were no longer changing. They had settled into a quiet arrangement unlike any before, and the moment he looked at them, a cold understanding passed through the bond. It was not a word. Not exactly. But it carried the unmistakable shape of one. Again. Ron's mouth went dry. "It wants another." Harry stepped forward at once. "That is enough for tonight." Ron did not argue, because he knew Harry was right. The deeper danger was not merely exhaustion. It was that the pattern had crossed another threshold. It was no longer only receiving and organizing. It was beginning to ask. And that changed the conflict once more. Until now they had been trying to understand a bond that was forming. Now they were facing a bond that had started to reach back with purpose. If they continued, they might gain answers. If they pushed too far, they might teach it too much. Ron kept his eyes on the frame as the final blue symbols held steady in the silver circle. Patient, and unblinking. Again. Not a command, not a plea. A request. And for the first time since the bolt from the blue had struck him, Ron understood that whatever lived in the pattern did not simply want to survive. It wanted to grow. Harry insisted that the session end there, and for once no one argued with him, not even Hermione, because the change in the frame had been too clear to ignore. The pattern was no longer merely reacting, no longer merely adjusting, and no longer merely sorting what it observed into some cold internal order. It had crossed into something nearer to intention, and that made every further step more dangerous than the last. The unspeakable sealed the silver frame behind 3 layers of warding before leading them from the chamber. Even then, Ron could still feel it, though faintly, like a distant flame seen through heavy mist. The bond did not vanish with walls or doors, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part of all, because distance no longer meant separation. Whatever had attached itself to him did not need to remain near its place of origin in order to remain present. It had found its anchor, and that anchor was him. They were given a secure room several levels above the Department of Mysteries, a chamber used for emergency ministry holding when an issue was too sensitive for ordinary offices and too unstable for St. Mungo's. It was plain, almost aggressively so, with stone walls, a narrow sofa, 2 straight-backed chairs, a heavy wooden table, and a single charmed lamp that burned with soft golden light. The door sealed from the inside and the outside alike, and every inch of the room carried protective enchantments that hummed beneath the surface like distant bees in summer. Hermione began pacing almost as soon as they entered. Harry remained by the door for a long while, his arms folded, his gaze lowered in the familiar way he had when anger and worry had become too tangled to separate. Ron sat heavily on the sofa, stretching his legs out in front of him, more tired than he cared to admit. The exhaustion did not feel ordinary. It was not the tiredness that came after work, or travel, or a fight. It felt as though his magic itself had spent something. For several minutes, none of them spoke, because there was too much to say, and none of it was likely to improve the hour. At last, Hermione stopped pacing and turned toward Ron. "You need rest." Ron gave her a thin smile. "That sounds lovely in theory." "I am serious," she said, though her voice softened. "Your body has been through repeated magical shock in a single night, and if the bond is affected by emotional and magical strain, then exhaustion will make everything harder to manage." Harry finally pushed away from the door. She is right. Ron looked from one to the other. I know she is right. I am simply pointing out that being told to sleep when something experimental is living in your chest is not especially comforting. Harry came over and sat in the chair opposite him, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You are not facing this alone." Ron let out a quiet breath. "I know." That was true, and it mattered more than he could easily say. Yet alongside the comfort of it came another truth that unsettled him just as much. The bond inside him was his alone. Harry could fight beside him. Hermione could reason through every impossible detail, but neither of them could feel the quiet second presence beneath his own thoughts. Neither of them could understand the eerie intimacy of it, the way it seemed to hover at the edge of intention, not speaking, not commanding, but learning. Hermione conjured parchment over the table and began arranging her notes into ordered sections. "We know several things now. First, the pattern was designed to adapt. Second, it has chosen Ron because his magic could withstand the stress of integration. Third, it responds not only to spell structure, but also to emotional charge. Fourth, it has begun symbolic output, which strongly suggests developing intent." Ron rested his head back against the stone wall. You make it sound so tidy when you list it." "That is because panic is untidy," Hermione said without looking up. "And tidiness is one of the few reliable ways to think when things are going badly." Harry glanced at her notes. "You missed one." She looked up. "It is getting faster," Harry said. "Every stage has come quicker than the last." Hermione's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, you are right." Ron closed his eyes for a moment, letting that settle. Faster. That was the part he disliked most. Not merely that the thing was changing, but that it was doing so with a speed that suggested momentum, as if each new understanding gave it the means to reach the next more easily. And then, with his eyes still closed, he felt it. A pulse. Not from across the ministry, not from the hidden chamber below, but from within. His eyes opened at once. Harry noticed immediately. "What is it?" Ron sat forward slowly. "It is active again." Hermione was beside him in an instant. "What kind of active?" He struggled for words. "Not like before. No pressure, no surge. It is more like—" He hesitated, because the comparison sounded absurd, and yet remained the closest truth he had. "Like something turning its attention toward me." Harry rose to his feet, wand already in hand. "Do you feel danger?" Ron listened inwardly, if such a thing could be called listening. The bond felt alert, but not hostile. It was almost impossible to explain, because all the ordinary words for threat did not fit. "No. At least, I do not think so." Hermione knelt in front of him, studying his face with intense concentration. "Is it reacting to something outside the room, or to something in you?" Ron drew a slow breath. "I cannot tell." He wished at once that he had not said it, because the moment he admitted uncertainty, the bond shifted again. A strange coolness spread through his right hand, and before he could warn them, the lamp on the table flickered. Then it brightened. Not violently, not with a burst, but steadily, as though an unseen hand had turned it higher. Harry's wand came up. "Ron." "I did not do that." Hermione looked from the lamp to Ron's hand. "But it moved when the bond changed." The lamp dimmed, then brightened again. This time the rhythm was unmistakable. "On. Off. On. Off." Harry frowned. "Is it reacting to the room's magic?" Hermione's eyes narrowed. "No. It is establishing sequence." The words landed with quiet force. Ron stared at the lamp as it repeated the pattern once more, almost patiently, and felt a cold line run through his chest. It is trying to communicate again. No one argued. Hermione moved carefully to the table and set a fresh sheet of parchment before the lamp. "Do not interrupt it unless it becomes unstable. We need to see whether the sequence changes." The lamp shone brightly 3 times in even intervals, then stopped. Then shone once, then stopped again. Harry looked sharply at Hermione. "Does that mean anything?" "Not yet," she said, already writing. "But it is not random." Ron kept his right hand flat against his knee. The coolness there had deepened, and with it came that same sense of attention he had felt earlier in the chamber. The difference was that now the pattern had no frame to use, no symbols on silver metal, no visible device through which to shape its intent. It had taken the nearest object touched by controllable light and made it into a signal. Again the lamp flashed. Twice. Then once. Then twice again. Hermione's quill raced over the parchment. "There is structure, but not one I recognize." Harry glanced at Ron. Can you sense what it means?" Ron almost said no. He almost dismissed the question, because how could he possibly understand the meaning of blinking lamplight from a magical construct that had been grown in secret beneath the ministry? Yet as he watched the pattern repeat, something within the bond responded with a faint thread of recognition. Not understanding. Association. He swallowed. It does not feel like words. Hermione looked up at once. What does it feel like? Ron kept his gaze on the lamp. More like categories, as if it is not naming something but pointing at a state. Harry frowned. That is not much help. No, Ron said quietly, but I think it is the truth. The lamp flashed once more, and with that final pulse, Ron felt a peculiar shift inside himself, as though the pattern had not merely sent a signal outward, but checked for an answer inward. The coolness in his hand faded. The lamp returned to a calm, golden glow, indistinguishable from ordinary enchanted light. The room went still. Hermione lowered her quill slightly. It stopped because it got a response. Harry turned to Ron. From you? Ron nodded slowly, though unease was tightening through him again. I did not choose to answer. It just knew I noticed. Hermione looked down at her notes, then back at him. Then we have another problem. Ron gave a tired, crooked smile. I was wondering when the next one would arrive. Her face remained grave. It may no longer require deliberate engagement to learn from you. Awareness alone might be enough. That silenced even Harry for a moment, because they all understood what it meant. Up until now, they had assumed that Ron's choices, his spells, his emotions, perhaps even his proximity, were the pathways through which the bond deepened. But if simple awareness, the act of recognizing a signal, was enough to complete a loop between them, then the distance between Ron's mind and the pattern had narrowed much further than they had believed. Harry straightened. Then he cannot be left alone. Ron blinked at him. I was not planning to wander off for a midnight stroll. That is not what I mean, Harry said. If it reaches for you in your sleep, or if it starts using things around you to communicate, someone needs to be there. Hermione nodded once. Agreed. Ron opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was no real point. Pride was not much use against a threat that could apparently speak through furniture. Hermione drew the parchments together and set them in careful order. The conflict has shifted again. This is no longer just about whether the bond completes. It is about whether the bond begins to establish two-way communication before we understand its purpose. Harry's voice was low and firm. And if it does, we shut it down. Ron looked at the lamp, now ordinary once more, and did not answer immediately. Because beneath Harry's certainty, beneath Hermione's reasoning, beneath the stone walls and warded door, and all the ministry's old protections, one fact had become impossible to ignore. The thing inside him was no longer only learning. It was trying to be understood. At last he rose from the sofa and crossed to the narrow bed in the corner of the room, more because his body would not keep going than because he believed rest would come easily. He sat on the edge of the mattress, then lay back without removing his shoes, staring up at the dimly lit ceiling where the warding lines were almost invisible beneath the plaster. Hermione settled into one chair with her notes. Harry took the other, wand still loose in his hand, as though he intended to keep watch whether Ron slept or not. The room quieted gradually. The lamp burned low. Somewhere far beneath them, behind sealed doors and the weight of hidden chambers, the silver frame continued to exist in darkness. And within Ron, quiet but unmistakable, the bond remained awake. He closed his eyes at last, not because he trusted the night, but because there was nothing else to do. A few moments later, just as sleep began to drift uncertainly toward him, he felt it again. Not a surge. Not a symbol. Not even a pulse. It was a thought-shaped touch at the edge of his mind. So faint it could almost have been mistaken for a dream. Not words. Never words. But the meaning was there all the same. More. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it was not the kind that carried rest with it, but rather a thin, shifting state in which thoughts drifted without ever fully settling. Ron lay still upon the narrow bed, aware of the faint hum of protective wards in the walls and the quiet presence of Harry and Hermione nearby. Yet even that sense of safety felt distant compared to the strange clarity forming within his own mind. At first there was only darkness, not the natural darkness of night, but something deeper, more complete, as though the world had been stripped away to leave only the space in which thought itself could exist. He might have believed he was dreaming, except that everything within that darkness felt too precise, too ordered to be shaped by imagination alone. Then the light appeared. It did not burst into being as it had before, nor did it tear through the void with the force of the bolt that had struck him at the burrow. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like a thread drawn through fabric, revealing itself piece by piece until it formed a single line suspended in the nothingness before him. Ron did not move, though he had the distinct sense that movement would not have changed anything. His body, wherever it might have been, felt distant and unimportant. What mattered was the connection, and the way the line of blue light seemed to exist not outside him, but alongside him. The line shifted. It bent once, forming a simple angle, then straightened again. There was no sound, no voice, yet Ron felt the same impression he had sensed before, the same underlying structure that carried meaning without words. He did not understand it, not fully, yet he could not dismiss it either. The line moved again, forming a different shape, then another, each one held for a moment before changing, as though the thing behind it were testing possibilities. Ron found himself focusing on the movement, not because he chose to, but because something within him recognized the importance of it. The presence in his chest, the steady, watchful awareness that had grown throughout the night, responded in kind, aligning itself with the shifting light as if seeking to interpret it. The shapes became more complex. Two lines now, crossing once, then separating. A third line joined them, forming a structure that held for longer than the rest. Ron felt a faint pull, not physical, but conceptual, as though the pattern was attempting to draw his understanding toward it, to bridge the gap between observation and recognition. "What are you trying to show me?" he asked, though he knew even as he spoke that the question did not belong to sound. The light paused. For a moment, everything remained still. Then the structure changed again, returning to a simpler form, a single line that pulsed once with quiet intensity. Ron felt it more than saw it. A single idea, not fully formed, but present. Connection. He frowned slightly, trying to grasp it more clearly. Connection to what? The line shifted. 2 points appeared at either end, faint but distinct. The pulse came again, stronger this time. Between. Ron's breath caught, though he did not know if he was truly breathing at all. The meaning was not precise, not yet, but it was enough to stir a realization that felt both distant and immediate. "You are not just showing me shapes," he said slowly. You are showing me relationships. The light brightened in response, not violently, but with a quiet affirmation that sent a ripple through the bond between them. Ron felt something shift inside him, as though a piece of understanding had settled into place, not complete, but stable enough to build upon. The pattern moved again. This time it did not form a simple line or a crossing structure, but something more intricate, a series of points connected by faint threads, each one pulsing in sequence. The order was deliberate, the spacing precise, and though Ron did not know the system, he could feel that it followed one. He watched, trying to keep his thoughts steady, because the moment he allowed confusion to rise, the pattern faltered slightly, as though reacting to the disturbance. He forced himself to remain calm, to observe without pushing for meaning that was not yet there. The sequence repeated. Once. Twice. A third time. And then, slowly, Ron began to see it. Not clearly, not as a full translation, but as a pattern of association. The points were not random. They corresponded to something he knew. Spells. Not the words themselves, but the structure behind them, the way magic formed before it took shape through incantation. His mind raced as the realization took hold. You are mapping magic. The light pulsed again, stronger than before. Ron felt a sharp flicker of excitement, the first true spark of it since the bolt had struck him, because for the first time, the connection did not feel like something being done to him, but something he could begin to engage with. You are showing me how you see it, he continued, the words forming with growing certainty. Not as spells, not as separate actions, but as patterns that connect. The sequence shifted once more, and this time the response carried something new. Not just affirmation, expansion. The points multiplied, the threads between them forming a network that stretched outward beyond what Ron could easily follow. Yet even in its complexity there was order, a sense that each connection served a purpose within a larger whole. Ron stared at it, both fascinated and unsettled. That is too much, he said, more to himself than to the pattern. I cannot understand all of that at once. The network dimmed slightly, as though in acknowledgement. Then it simplified. The points reduced again, the threads fewer, the sequence slower. Ron felt a strange sense of relief, and with it came another realization that settled into place with quiet certainty. You are adjusting to me, he said. The pulse came again. Yes. The meaning was clearer this time, though still without words, because it did not need them. Ron let out a slow breath, his thoughts shifting from confusion to something more deliberate. If you can adjust to what I understand, then I can learn this. The light held steady. Then, slowly, it formed the earlier structure again, the one that had first drawn his attention, the simple arrangement of lines that had carried the initial sense of connection. Ron studied it more carefully now, looking not at the shape itself, but at the way it formed, the sequence of movement that brought it into being. He felt the presence within him align once more, mirroring the process in a way that was no longer accidental. For a brief moment, he saw it. Not with his eyes, but with the same inner sense that the pattern seemed to use. The way magic flowed. The way intention shaped it. The way different actions connected beneath the surface. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it appeared. But it left behind a trace that could not be dismissed. Ron drew in a breath, though the air felt distant. You are not just learning me, he said quietly. You are teaching me. The light did not pulse this time. It remained steady, constant. And in that stillness, Ron understood something that sent a quiet chill through him, because it reshaped the conflict in a way he had not expected. This was no longer only about controlling the bond, or preventing it from completing, or even understanding it before it changed him beyond recognition. It had become something more complex. Because if the pattern could teach as well as learn, then the danger was no longer one-sided. He was not only at risk of being shaped by it, he was also being given the means to shape himself in ways he had never considered. And that raised a question far more difficult than any they had faced so far. If the power being offered to him could be understood and controlled, should it be rejected at all? The light shifted once more, returning to the simplest form, a single line, steady and unchanging. Ron felt the presence within him settle into quiet alignment, as though the exchange had reached a natural pause. The darkness around them began to fade, not abruptly, but gradually, as though the connection itself were loosening just enough to allow him to return. The last impression remained with him as everything else slipped away. Not a demand, not a warning, but a possibility. More. Ron's eyes opened. The room returned at once, the dim light, the stone walls, the quiet presence of Harry and Hermione still awake, still watching. For a moment he lay there, silent, trying to separate what had been dream from what had been real, though the distinction no longer felt entirely meaningful. Harry leaned forward slightly. "You were not just sleeping." Ron turned his head toward him. "No." Hermione set her parchment aside. "What happened?" Ron stared at the ceiling for a long moment before answering, because the truth felt both simple and impossible at the same time. "It showed me something," he said slowly. "Not in words, not in spells, in structure." Harry frowned. "Structure of what?" Ron's gaze shifted toward them, and there was something new in it now, something uncertain but undeniable. "Magic," he said. The word hung in the room, heavier than it should have been. Hermione's breath caught slightly, though she did not interrupt. Ron sat up slowly, the lingering echo of the connection still present within him, though quieter now, as though the pattern had retreated just enough to observe rather than act. "It was not just reacting," he continued. "It was guiding me through it, showing me how it understands magic, not as separate spells but as something connected underneath." Harry's expression darkened. "And you understood it?" Ron hesitated. Then he nodded. "Not all of it," he said, "but enough to know that it is not random, and it is not broken." Hermione leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then what is it?" Ron held her gaze, the answer settling into place with quiet certainty. "It is a system," he said, "and I think it is trying to make me part of it." The room seemed smaller after Ron spoke those words, not because its walls had shifted, but because the meaning behind them pressed inward from every side, tightening the space until even the quiet hum of the protective wards felt heavier than before. Hermione did not respond at once, though her eyes searched Ron's face with a focus so intense it was almost unsettling, as though she were trying to determine whether what he had experienced could be trusted, or whether it had already begun to distort him in ways that could not be easily undone. Harry was the first to break the silence, his voice low and edged with caution that bordered on disbelief. "You are telling us that the thing inside you is not just reacting, not just learning, but organizing magic itself into some kind of structure, and it wants you to become part of that structure." Ron nodded slowly, though the certainty he had felt in the moment of understanding had softened into something more uncertain, now that he had to explain it aloud. That is the closest way I can describe it without it sounding completely mad. Hermione exhaled quietly, then moved back to the table where her notes lay scattered in careful arrangement. "It does not sound mad," she said, though there was no comfort in her tone. "It sounds consistent with everything we have observed so far." Harry turned toward her sharply. "You cannot possibly be saying that this is acceptable." "I am saying," Hermione replied, forcing calm into her voice, "that it fits the pattern of behavior we have already identified. It adapts, it categorizes, it forms symbolic output, and now it appears to be attempting structured interaction. If anything, this is the logical next step." Ron rubbed his hands together, more out of restless energy than cold. "Logical or not, it is still happening to me, and I would very much like to know how we stop it from deciding what I am supposed to be." Hermione's expression softened slightly at that, though her mind did not slow. "We do not yet know whether it is trying to decide that, or whether it is offering something that you can accept or reject." Harry gave a short, incredulous breath. "You are talking about this as though it is a choice." Ron looked at him, and for a moment there was a flicker of something sharper in his eyes. "Is it not?" The question lingered. Harry did not answer immediately, because the truth was not simple. They had faced curses that enslaved, spells that consumed, and forces that twisted the will until it no longer belonged to the person it had once guided. Those had never been choices. Those had been battles. But this felt different. Hermione spoke carefully, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "If it were forcing itself on you, we would have seen that already. The surges were uncontrolled, yes, but they were not directed toward domination. They were reactions. Now that it is stabilizing, it is no longer pushing in the same way." Ron nodded slightly. "It is not pushing at all right now. It is waiting." Harry frowned. "Waiting for what?" Ron hesitated, because the answer felt dangerously close to something he wasn't sure he wanted to admit. "For me to respond." Silence followed again, deeper than before. Because that changed everything. If the pattern was no longer forcing its growth, if it was no longer driving toward completion without regard for Ron's will, then the nature of the conflict had shifted yet again. It was no longer a race to stop something inevitable. It had become a negotiation with something that could adapt to his choices. Harry straightened slowly. "Then we do not respond." Ron looked at him. "You think ignoring it will make it go away?" "I think," Harry said firmly, "that if it requires your engagement to continue developing, then we deny it that engagement until we find a way to remove it safely." Hermione shook her head slightly. "That may slow it, but it will not stop it. The bond is already established, and passive interaction may still occur. We saw that with the lamp. Awareness alone was enough to complete a response cycle." Ron leaned back against the wall again, letting that settle. "So even if I do nothing, it keeps learning from me anyway." "Yes," Hermione said quietly. Harry's jaw tightened. "Then doing nothing is not a solution." "No," Hermione agreed. "It is not." The room fell into thought once more, but this time the silence carried a sharper edge, because the options before them were no longer theoretical. Each path held risk, and none of them offered certainty. Ron closed his eyes briefly, focusing on the presence within him. It remained calm, steady, almost patient, as though it had no need to rush. That alone unsettled him more than the earlier surges had, because patience suggested confidence, and confidence suggested that whatever this thing was, it believed it would reach its goal eventually. "What if," he said slowly, opening his eyes again. "We are looking at this the wrong way." Hermione looked up at once. "Explain." Ron drew a breath, choosing his words carefully. "We keep talking about stopping it, or slowing it, or preventing it from finishing whatever it is trying to do. But what if that is not the right question?" Harry frowned. "Then what is the right question?" Ron met his gaze. "What if the real question is what happens if it does finish?" The words landed with quiet force. Hermione's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration. "You are suggesting that we consider the completed state as a potential outcome, rather than something to avoid at all costs." "I am suggesting," Ron said, "that we do not actually know whether the completed state is worse than the unstable one." Harry stared at him. "You cannot be serious." Ron held his ground. "Think about it. Right now it is unpredictable, reactive, and still learning. That is when it is most dangerous. If it stabilizes, if it becomes consistent, then at least we know what we are dealing with. And if what we are dealing with is something that rewrites how your magic works entirely," Harry shot back, "then we have already lost." Hermione stepped in before the argument could escalate. "There is truth on both sides. Stability would reduce the immediate risk of uncontrolled surges, but it could introduce a more permanent alteration that we cannot reverse." Ron nodded. "Exactly." He paused, then added quietly, "But I felt it in there, when I was, wherever that was. It was not trying to take anything from me, it was trying to show me something." Harry's expression hardened. "And you trust that?" Ron did not answer immediately, because trust was not the right word. "I do not know if I trust it," he said at last, "but I do know that it is not behaving like anything we have fought before. It is not acting like a curse. It is not acting like dark magic. It is acting like a system trying to include something new." Hermione's breath caught slightly. "Integration." "Yes," Ron said. The word settled into place, and with it came a new understanding of the conflict they faced. This was not a battle against an enemy that sought to destroy or dominate. It was a confrontation with something that sought to incorporate. Harry shook his head slowly. "That does not make it safer." "No," Ron agreed, "but it might make it predictable." The lamp flickered once. All three of them turned toward it instantly. The light steadied, then dimmed slightly, then returned to its normal glow. No sequence followed. No pattern. Just a single interruption. Ron felt the presence within him stir faintly, not with urgency, but with acknowledgement, as though it had registered the shift in their thoughts. Hermione's voice dropped to a whisper. "It is listening again." Harry's grip tightened on his wand. "Then we stop talking about it in the open." Ron shook his head. "That will not change anything. It does not need words to understand." The truth of that hung in the air, undeniable. Because if the pattern could read intention, if it could respond to awareness itself, then silence would not hide anything from it. It would only remove the structure that allowed them to understand it in return. Ron pushed himself to his feet, slowly, the exhaustion still present but no longer overwhelming. "We cannot avoid it, we cannot ignore it, and we cannot remove it yet." He looked at both of them, his voice steady despite the weight behind it. "So we either keep learning faster than it does," he said, "or we let it decide what I become." Hermione met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Then we learn." Harry hesitated, then gave a single reluctant nod. "Together." Ron felt a small, quiet steadiness settle in his chest, not from the presence itself, but from the certainty that he wasn't facing it alone. Yet even as that thought formed, he felt the bond shift again, ever so slightly, as though something within it had taken note of the decision. Not with approval, not with resistance, but with understanding. And that, more than anything else, told him that whatever came next would not be simple. Because the pattern was no longer just observing. It was beginning to follow their choices. And sooner or later, it would begin to shape them in return. Morning did not arrive all at once within the ministry, because no sunlight touched the lower levels, and no dawn wind passed through those guarded halls. Yet the night still loosened its hold by degrees, as if even beneath London the world could sense that 1 hour had yielded to another. The charmed lamp in the secure room brightened automatically, shifting from the low amber hush of midnight to a clearer gold, and in that change the weariness of the previous hours became impossible to ignore. Hermione had not slept at all. She remained seated at the table, surrounded by ordered stacks of parchment covered in her quick, precise hand, her hair more unruly than ever, and her expression sharpened by exhaustion rather than softened by it. Harry had dozed only in fragments, never fully relaxing, his wand still within reach even in sleep, as though he had learned long ago that true rest was something the world rarely allowed him to keep for long. Ron, for his part, had drifted in and out of shallow, uneasy dreams that left more traces than comfort. And each time he surfaced fully, he became aware at once of the same quiet presence inside him, steady as a second pulse. It had not gone silent. It had not gone away. It had simply become accustomed to remaining there. That, more than anything else, unsettled him. He sat up slowly upon the narrow bed, rubbing both hands over his face, and found Hermione already watching him with the alertness of someone who had been waiting for the exact moment he returned fully to himself. "You were dreaming again," she said. Ron lowered his hands. "Was I talking?" "No," Hermione replied. "That would have been simpler. The lamp shifted twice, the wards along the ceiling reacted once, and the glass water jug on the table developed a thin layer of frost and then returned to normal." Ron stared at her. "That sounds less like dreaming, and more like the room being cursed." Hermione did not smile. "I know." Harry was awake now as well, sitting forward in his chair with that familiar, controlled tension settling over him in an instant. "How do you feel?" Ron thought about the question carefully, because the obvious answer would have been tired, confused, and increasingly concerned for his future, yet none of those truly covered what mattered most. He drew a slow breath and listened inwardly, as strange as that still felt. "Clearer," he said at last. Hermione's eyes narrowed at once. "Clearer in what way?" Ron hesitated because he knew how the answer would sound. "I can feel where it ends." Harry frowned. "Where what ends?" "The pattern," Ron said quietly. "Before, it felt like something tangled through everything, too close to separate. Now it feels more defined. Not gone, not weaker, just easier to sense as itself." Hermione rose at once, all exhaustion replaced by focus. "That means the bond is organizing internally. It is refining its structure." Ron gave her a flat look. "You always have a way of making alarming things sound academic." "I would rather make them understandable than mysterious," she said, and there was no irritation in it, only urgency. Before any of them could say more, there came a firm knock at the sealed door, followed by the scrape of external wards shifting aside. Harry was on his feet immediately, wand in hand, but the voice that followed belonged to the unspeakable from the night before. "I have brought what you requested," he said from outside, "and something you did not know to request." Harry looked at Hermione, then at Ron, and only after a brief pause did he move to the door and unseal it. The Unspeakable entered carrying a long, narrow case of black wood and a bundle of old parchments tied with silver thread. He looked no less severe in the morning than he had in the night, though there was a fatigue in his eyes now that had not been visible before. Behind him came a second witch. Ron did not know. Elderly and fine-boned, with white hair drawn tightly back and robes embroidered not with official ministry insignia, but with old protective symbols Ron vaguely recognized from stories Bill used to tell about curse breakers and archaic wardcraft. The Unspeakable inclined his head toward her. "This is Matron Celiard. She was among the original consultants brought in when the project was first designed." Hermione stood straighter. "A ritual theorist." The old witch looked at her with mild approval. "And one who still remembers that ritual theory existed before ministries learned to bury every dangerous idea beneath 10 layers of paperwork." Ron decided at once that he liked her. She came directly to him, not hurriedly and not fearfully, and studied him with the calm, unsentimental gaze of someone who had seen stranger things than this and survived them all. "So," she said at last, "you are the boy it chose." Ron raised an eyebrow. "I am not sure I would have put it that way, but yes, that seems to be the general disaster." A faint curve touched her mouth, though it vanished quickly. "Humor under pressure. Good. That will matter." Harry shut the door behind them again. "You said you brought something important." The Unspeakable set the case and parchments upon the table. "We searched restricted archives connected to the original experiment. Most of the project logs were sealed or destroyed after the containment failure, but some theoretical notes remained under secondary classification. We also found the framework text from which the design was adapted." Hermione was already reaching for the bundle of parchments. "Adapted from what?" The old witch answered, and her voice altered the air in the room because it carried the weight of something ancient and unwelcome. "Not from a modern spell," she said, "but from a pre-ministry magical lattice once studied by a handful of scholars in the late medieval period. A system for linking active spellwork to living magical cores so that power could be shared, balanced, and redirected without the constant use of wand movement." Harry's expression hardened. "That sounds dangerously close to weaponized magic." "It became that in the wrong hands," Matron Celiard said. "Which is why the work was abandoned, and why only fragments survived." Ron felt the presence within him stir faintly at her words, not violently, but with a quiet recognition that made his stomach tighten. "You are saying this thing inside me is based on something much older than whatever they built downstairs." "Yes," the old witch said. "The Department of Mysteries did not invent it. They attempted to recreate a broken piece of it." Hermione was reading rapidly now, eyes moving over the old notes with fierce concentration. "A lattice," she murmured. "That explains the structural mapping. It is not organizing spells one by one. It is trying to position them within a wider magical network." Ron looked at her. "Which means what for me, in practical terms?" Hermione lowered the parchment slowly. "It means the pattern is not trying to become a spell inside you. It is trying to make your magic function as a node within a system." Even Harry, who had heard stranger things than most people ever would, seemed taken aback by that. "A node," he repeated. "You are saying it wants to connect through him to something larger." The Unspeakable nodded once. "That is now our leading conclusion." Ron sat very still. Until that moment, the threat had felt intimate, personal, and contained within the boundaries of his own body and choices. That had been frightening enough. But this idea, this possibility that the pattern did not end with him, that it might seek a wider completion beyond his own magic, changed the shape of the conflict entirely. "What larger system?" he asked quietly. The old witch placed one hand upon the black wooden case, though she did not yet open it. "We do not know whether such a system still exists in full. Most evidence suggests it was shattered centuries ago. But if enough fragments remained hidden, dormant, or embedded in older magical constructions, then an active node could begin seeking them." Harry's voice grew colder. "And if it finds them?" "Then the lattice may attempt partial restoration," said Matron Celiard. "Perhaps not across the whole country, perhaps not even consciously, but enough to produce linked magical events, synchronized surges, and unstable resonance wherever old fragments still remain." Hermione looked up sharply. "The other incidents, the surges reported across Britain." "Yes," said the unspeakable. "We believed they were isolated echoes. They may instead have been distant responses." Ron let out a slow breath, and now he understood why the bolt had not felt random, why the line of light in the healer's chamber had seemed to recognize him, and why the thing within him had never behaved like a mere burst of stolen power. It had been incomplete, and from the moment it found him, it had begun not merely to stabilize, but to orient itself. To connect. The conflict, clear at last, stood before them in full shape now. It was no longer only about Ron surviving the bond. It was about whether the bond inside Ron would awaken something older, wider, and far less controllable than any one wizard. Hermione set the parchments aside and looked directly at the old witch. "If the pattern is based on an ancient lattice, then there must have been a method for severing or isolating a node." "There was," Matron Celiard said. Hope rose too quickly in Ron's chest, fragile and sharp. Then she continued. "But not without consequence. A living node cannot simply be cut away once it has taken root. To sever it entirely, one must either destroy the node's function or redirect it into a closed form." Harry frowned. "Translate that." The old witch's gaze settled on Ron. "Either the bond is ripped apart, which would likely leave his magic permanently damaged, perhaps even extinguished." Ron's throat tightened. "Or," she said, "the node is completed in a contained ritual and folded inward so that it remains part of him, but cannot reach beyond him." Silence followed, vast and absolute. Hermione was the first to speak, though very quietly. "So those are the choices. Break him, or bind it fully within him." "Yes," Matron Celiard said. Harry turned away for a moment, jaw set, one hand pressed against the back of the chair as though he needed something solid to hold the anger that had nowhere useful to go. Ron looked from one face to another and felt the weight of the truth settle into him more heavily than any surge or symbol had yet done. The story he was in, the one forced upon him by a bolt from the blue, had finally given him its central decision. He could fight the thing within him and risk losing the very magic that had always been part of his life, part of his family, part of who he was. Or he could let the bond complete in a way that might preserve him, but only if he accepted that some lasting part of it would remain with him forever. Matron Celiard placed her hand flat upon the black case. "There is one more matter." Hermione looked up. "What matter?" The old witch opened the case. Inside, resting upon dark velvet, lay a narrow silver instrument shaped somewhere between a wand and a tuning fork, its two delicate prongs carved with the same shifting symbols Ron had seen upon the frame below. "It was the original focusing key," she said. "The one object designed to guide a living node safely through closure." Ron stared at it, and the presence within him answered at once. Not with a surge. Not with pain. But with a clear, unmistakable awakening. The silver prongs began to glow blue. The blue light that rose from the silver instrument did not flare wildly, nor did it lash through the room with the violence of the first bolt that had struck Ron at the burrow. Instead, it awakened with a calm and terrible certainty, as though the object had spent years in silence, waiting for the exact presence that could call it fully back into purpose. Ron felt the response in his chest before he fully saw it with his eyes. The pattern within him straightened, if such a thing could be said of magic, and every line of its quiet structure seemed to turn toward the instrument in the old witch's hands. It was not hunger. It was not panic. It was recognition so complete that it left no room for doubt. "That is it," Ron said, his voice lower than he intended. "That is what it knows." Matron Cilliard did not move the instrument closer. "Yes," she said, "and now we know that the bond inside you is deep enough to respond to the key directly." Harry stepped forward at once, his expression hardening. "Then close the case." The old witch looked at him, not dismissively, but with the patience one reserves for truth that will not bend to urgency. "If I close the case now, the response will subside, but the fact of it will remain. We cannot pretend this object does not matter merely because it frightens us." Harry's jaw tightened, though he did not argue further. Hermione came to stand beside the table, her eyes fixed on the glowing silver prongs. "If that is the focusing key, then it is not merely a tool, it is a guide for the completion ritual." "It is more than that," said the unspeakable. "According to the archive notes, the key does not force closure. It harmonizes with the living node and reveals whether a stable inward folding is possible at all." Ron looked from the instrument to the old parchments scattered across the table. "Meaning it tells us whether I can survive letting this thing complete inside me." Matron Cilliard gave a single grave nod. "Yes." The room fell still again, but this time the silence held shape, because the choice before them was no longer abstract. Until now they had only spoken of possibilities. Now a path existed, narrow and dangerous, yet real. Ron became aware that the cool clarity he had felt since waking was deepening. The bond was not agitated by the key. It was attentive, curious, ready. That frightened him more than another surge might have done. Hermione glanced at him at once. "What is it doing?" Ron searched for the right words. "It is not reaching for the key the way it reached for the frame. It feels more like it is aligning." Matron Cilliard's expression sharpened. "That is important. Alignment suggests the pattern recognizes the key as part of its original design, rather than as an external threat." Harry folded his arms. "And if we use it?" The old witch answered plainly. "Then the ritual could be attempted. The bond would either fold inward and become a sealed part of Ron's magic, unable to connect beyond him." Ron waited. "Or it would fail, and the consequences would depend on the degree of collapse." Harry's face darkened. "That is not an answer." "It is the only honest one," she replied. Ron looked at the glowing instrument and felt the full weight of the conflict settle into place at last. The choice was no longer between fear and safety, because safety had already gone. It was between two losses, and he had to decide which loss he could live with. If they tried to tear the bond out, he might lose magic altogether. If they completed it, he might keep his power, but never again as something entirely untouched by what had found him. He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Brilliant. That is a proper trap, that is." Hermione's voice softened. "Ron." He turned toward her, and for a moment the fear in him rose plainly enough that he could not cover it with wit. "I know what everyone will say. I know we should be careful, and gather every fact and think this through from 12 different angles. But the thing is already moving, Hermione. If it is really part of some larger lattice, then every hour we delay is another hour for it to reach outward." Harry looked at him sharply, because he knew it was true. Ron went on, more steadily now. "I am not saying we rush blindly. I am saying the question is no longer whether we act. The question is whether we act while it is still listening to me." The words hung there. Because that was the heart of it. The bond had not turned cruel. It had not broken his will. It had not tried to seize him by force. If anything, it had become more responsive the more honestly he faced it. That might not make it good. It might not even make it safe. But it meant the window had not yet closed. Hermione drew in a slow breath. "If we do this, it must be controlled perfectly. The room, the wards, the sequence, the key, Ron's state of mind, all of it." Matron Cilliard inclined her head. "Agreed." The unspeakable gathered the parchments into a single stack. "The ritual chamber below can be adapted. It was built for lattice work originally." Harry's eyes flicked to Ron. "You do not have to decide this second." Ron looked down at his hands, then inward. The bond met his attention quietly, with that same patient awareness it had shown again and again. No demand rose from it, no pressure, only readiness. When he looked back up, his expression had changed. He was still afraid. Anyone could see that. But beneath the fear, there was something steadier now, something that had always been part of him, though too many people forgot it until the moment it mattered most. Resolve. "Yes," Ron said quietly. "I do." He looked at Harry, then Hermione, then the old witch with the silver key. "We do the folding ritual," he said. "We finish this before it reaches anything beyond me." The instrument in the case brightened once, clear as a struck bell, though no sound was heard. And deep within Ron, the pattern answered. Preparations began at once, and with them the strange comfort that sometimes comes when fear is forced to give way to action. The secure room emptied of hesitation, and filled instead with purpose. Hermione sorted the ritual notes into exact sequence, comparing the ancient lattice instructions with the Department of Mysteries records until every repeated symbol and every dangerous omission had been marked. Harry went with the unspeakable to inspect the chamber below and returned only when he had personally tested each ward himself. Matron Cilliard remained with Ron, not speaking much, but watching him with the calm attention of someone measuring not his strength, but his steadiness. By the time they led him back to the ritual chamber, the silver frame at its center had been altered. What had once been a device for observation had become a ring of containment and guidance. Fresh runes had been laid into the floor in pale gold. 4 ward stones stood at equal distance around the platform, each humming softly with restrained power. Above it all, the air carried a fine blue shimmer, like moonlight trapped beneath water. Ron stepped onto the center of the platform and felt the bond within him answer at once. Not violently, not eagerly, simply awake. Hermione stood just beyond the ring, parchment in one hand, wand in the other. Harry took his place opposite her, face set, every line of him ready to intervene, even though they all knew that once the process began, intervention might do more harm than help. Matron Celiard held the silver key with both hands, and the old instrument now glowed with a light so clear and cold it seemed almost alive. "This is the final shape of the conflict," she said, her voice carrying evenly through the chamber. "If the lattice within you can be folded inward, it will remain sealed within your magic and no longer seek anything beyond you. If it resists closure, the chamber will attempt forced separation. You must hold to yourself as clearly as you can, because the ritual will follow the strongest pattern present. If that pattern is yours, you will keep your magic and contain the bond. If it is not, we may lose both." Ron gave a faint, crooked smile. "No pressure, then." Harry's mouth twitched despite the strain. Hermione looked close to tears for the first time that night, though her voice, when she spoke, remained steady. "Remember who you are. Do not let it define that for you." Ron looked at her, then at Harry, and something in him settled more firmly than any ward in the room. "It won't," he said. Matron Celiard lifted the key. The moment its silver prongs aligned with the frame, the chamber woke. Blue lines blazed across the floor, the ring around Ron rose in shimmering layers, and the bond inside him surged upward, not in chaos, but in perfect recognition. He gasped as light ran through him, tracing every channel of his magic, drawing it into sharp and burning clarity. For one terrible instant, it felt as though he stood inside two selves at once, the one that had always been his, and the one the lattice had begun to build beside it. "Now," said Matron Celiard. Hermione spoke the first sequence of guiding words from the parchment. The symbols around the ring shifted. Harry cast the anchoring charm that locked the platform to Ron's own magical signature. Then the old witch lowered the silver key until its light met the center of Ron's chest without touching him at all. Pain struck. Not the pain of injury, but the pain of separation and joining happening at once, as though every part of the bond were being asked a single question and forced to answer truthfully. Ron saw nothing with his eyes then. The chamber vanished. The others vanished. There was only the inner space where the lattice lived, and within it the vast, shining structure he had glimpsed before, the web of magic that sought connection, order, expansion. It reached outward. Ron understood then that it wasn't evil. That mattered, though not in the way he once might have thought. It wasn't cruel, and it wasn't dark for darkness's sake. It simply wanted to become more than it was, to complete itself through every available path. And that was exactly why it had to be stopped there. "You stay with me," Ron said into that bright inner vastness, though no sound existed there. "You do not go beyond me." The lattice responded, not in words, but in resistance. Not hatred, not defiance, only purpose. For a heartbeat, Ron wavered. Then other things rose within him, stronger than fear and older than the bond itself. The burrow in winter, his mother's voice, George laughing too loudly at the wrong moment, Ginny's fierce glare, Hermione in the library, Harry beside him in every darkness worth naming, the long years of being the one people underestimated, the war, the choices, the fact that ordinary did not mean weak and never had. That was his pattern. Not borrowed, not built by secret magic under the ministry, his. He seized the bond with that truth. The struggle changed at once. The shining lattice did not vanish, but it bent inward, its reaching paths folding back through themselves, not broken, but redirected. The vast network contracted. Light turned, spiraled, and tightened. Ron felt the force of it move through his magic like a storm being drawn into a single star. The pain sharpened, then sharpened again, until he thought he might come apart with it. Outside the inner space, he dimly heard Hermione shouting the next sequence, heard Harry call his name, heard Matron Celiard force the key lower as the chamber blazed white-blue around them all. "Hold!" the old witch cried. Ron held. Not because he was fearless, but because he had decided. The final movement came like a bolt from the blue in reverse. What had once torn into him from nowhere now folded inward with absolute force, sealing layer by layer until the reaching structure became a closed pattern at the center of his own magic. Then the light went out. The chamber rang with silence. Ron dropped to one knee, catching himself with one hand against the floor of the platform. Every breath felt hard-won. The runes around him were dark again. The silver frame stood still. The key in Matron Celiard's hand had lost its glow. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then Hermione was beside him. "Ron." He looked up at her, dazed, and found Harry there too, one hand already on his shoulder. "Well," Ron said hoarsely, "if that worked, I'd like it noted for the record that it was a deeply unpleasant experience." Harry let out the breath he had been holding and laughed once, unsteadily. Hermione made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. Matron Celiard stepped forward and studied Ron with grave care. "How does it feel?" Ron closed his eyes. The presence was still there, but it had changed. It no longer pressed, reached, or waited. It rested within him as a sealed and silent structure, part of his magic now, yet no longer searching beyond it. He could sense it clearly, like a hidden chamber in a house he knew was his. "It's quiet," he said. The unspeakable, pale with strain, looked toward the dormant frame. "And the external resonance is gone." Hermione straightened slowly, relief and wonder mixing in her face. "Then the node is closed." Ron rose carefully to his feet. He felt tired beyond measure, altered in ways he would likely spend a long time understanding, but he also felt unmistakably himself. That, in the end, was the answer. He had not lost his magic. He had not become something else entirely. He had taken the thing that had chosen him and forced it to remain within the boundaries of who he already was. Harry squeezed his shoulder once. "You did it." Ron glanced at him and managed a tired smile. "Of course I did. Someone had to save the day while you were busy glaring at ancient artifacts." Later, much later, after the ministry had sealed the chamber, after the reports had been stripped down to the bare truth that could be trusted, and after the first rumors of strange surges across Britain had ceased altogether, Ron stood outside with Harry and Hermione beneath a real sky at last. It was morning now, pale and clear. No bolts crossed the blue. No hidden force stirred in answer, only wind, light, and the honest quiet of an ordinary day. Ron looked upward for a long moment, then let out a slow breath. The adventure had ended. The conflict was resolved. The lattice would go no farther than him, and the world beyond would remain untouched by what had nearly awakened beneath it. Hermione slipped her hand into his. Harry stood at his other side, silent but smiling. And for the first time since the night at the Burrow, Ron felt no pull toward anything beyond himself. Only home.
Ну що ж, друзі, коли Рон перестав боротися з тим дивним зв'язком усередині себе і вперше спробував його зрозуміти, а не просто відштовхнути. Якби я міг сказати собі молодшому одне, то сказав би, не все незрозуміле у твоєму житті є ворогом. Іноді найбільше лякає не небезпека, а відсутність відповіді. Рон хотів лише позбутися того, чого не зрозумів. Але справжній крок уперед почався саме тоді, коли він набрався сміливості, зупинився і подивився уважніше. У житті ми часто робимо навпаки, відштовхуємо складні почуття, тікаємо від власних страхів і не хочемо дивитися на проблеми, які не можемо одразу пояснити. Та що дуже часто те, що нас лякає, втрачає частину своєї сили в ту мить, коли ми починаємо його вивчати. Не поспішайте воювати за кожною невідомістю. Спочатку спробуйте зрозуміти, чому вона з'являлася і чого вона насправді від нас хоче. А мені здається, справжня мудрість – це не завжди битва. Іноді справжня мудрість починається з тихого бажання подивитися страху в очі і чесно сказати «Я хочу тебе зрозуміти». Так що, з вами, як завжди, я, ваш автор, ваш Саламандр. Будь ласка, якщо вам не важко, залишайте коментарі, трошки будемо просувати мої відео. Якщо, звісно, вони вам подобаються, ставте лайки. Якщо не подобається, ставте дізи. Дякую всім за увагу. До наступних відео.